As ever, my name is Sam, and I'm really happy to be here with Professor Samir Gandesha, who is the director of the Institute for the Humanities at Fraser University and also associate professor there. He wrote a really great piece, which we've linked in the show notes, called Posthuman Fascism. It's also very brief, which is, a great virtue. So before you listen to this interview, I really recommend going and reading that piece, coming back. And so hopefully more of this discussion will make sense to you. But we're going to start fairly broad. You promoted a particular understanding of fascism using a definition that was written first by, I think, Samir Amin, which has two parts. So the first part is that fascism is a response to a kind of a deep crisis in capitalism. And the second part is that it operates through the erosion of democracy. And you clarify this means liberal democracy. I think it's a useful clarification. Through the appeal to a collective identity. So, this is a fairly pared down definition by the standards of definitions of fascism. Normally, you get, definitions of fascism that are whole kind of paragraphs of simply definition, lots of kind of lists. I wonder what is it about this particular definition, these two elements, the response to deep crisis and the erosion of democracy through collective identity, that you find so compelling?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, I'd just like to thank you, Sam, for the invitation to be on the podcast. I think you're doing really great work, and I've learned a lot, actually, from listening to previous episodes of it. So the reason why I found the Amin account of fascism so useful is because, I was obviously looking at it in terms of framing the introduction for Spectres of Fascism, and Spectres of Fascism really tries to take a global perspective. So Samir Amin's world system approach was quite helpful in terms of having a sense of the differences and similarities between center, semi-periphery, and periphery. And that's also quite important as well in terms of thinking about fascism in terms of a logic of endocolonialism, although he doesn't talk about that, but it does help set up that discussion as well. I think it's also important, as you pointed out, to correct him a little bit. So fascism isn't a categorical rejection of democracy per se, but of liberal democracy. And this becomes very clear in figures like Viktor Orban, right, who makes a claim for illiberal democracy. So there is a way in which fascists and right-wing populists or authoritarian populists also try to make a kind of case for a certain sort of democracy, but it's an exclusionary form, and it's one that built upon some notion of the general will, the will of the people that is in some way embodied in a particular cultural tradition, which is itself taken up by and personified by a strong leader. So I think these elements are particularly useful in thinking about contemporary forms of fascism. You can look at this in terms of Trump. You can also usefully understand Narendra Modi and Erdogan in these terms, Bolsonaro as well. And I think also from the standpoint of a left response to the rise of these authoritarian regimes, I think it reminds us that we need to take liberal democracy seriously, that we can't take its institutions for granted. We must move away from a kind of reified understanding, which means that we try not to think about the institutions of liberal democracy as somehow bequeathed by the powers that be, or somehow dropping from the sky. Rather, we must understand them as forms of struggle, historical struggles for inclusion on the part of working men and women, LGBTQ plus peoples, Indigenous, racialized peoples, and so on. And these are for the right to associate, organize. Obviously, the right to vote, for aspects of the welfare state, universal health care, NHS in Britain, obviously, and so on. Today, of course, we think about this as well in terms of the kind of push you see in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party for left cabinet appointments, and we've seen maybe a success, one could say, at least initially, in terms of having the first Indigenous person appointed as the Secretary of the Interior, and I'm thinking of Deb Haaland in this case. Of course, it remains to be seen what she can do, but I think it's really important that we both defend the institutions of liberal democracy and also, in a sense, seek to democratize liberal democracy.
Great, yeah, that's a really kind of robust defense of I think some of or kind of pushback against some of the kind of more glib rejections on the far left, certainly, of all the manifestations of liberal democracy. And so the article that everyone has now, of course, gone away and read, has a category of post-human fascism. So this is, of course, opposed to something else, and I'm guessing what it's opposed to. I think it says in the article it's opposed to anti-humanism. So interwar fascism, the period that we think about as kind of the classical fascist period, is anti-humanist, right? And in doing so, it's just to kind of roll back universalist legacy of the Enlightenment through imperialism internationally, and also the workers' movement and women's rights and racial oppression within Europe as well. So and often these two parts are conjoined, right? So the imperial endeavors and were somehow kind of echoed back into Europe, and this is the theory of endocolonialism in very, very brief sketch. But it was also anti-humanist in some other ways, I guess. So fascism, as Arendt puts it, dispensed with public life and made private individuals out of all citizens, stripping them of interest in and a connection with public affairs. And in this sense, it dehumanized people because it extracts them from their society. It kind of forcibly atomizes them into their own kind of atomized mass. In the concentration camps and death camps, these capacities for self-individualization were reduced, again, by says Arendt, to a collection of reactions and reflexes. But we're distinguishing between this anti-humanism and a post-humanism. Maybe you want to dispute the categorization of anti-humanism that I've given there, or the kind of characterization of anti-humanism I've given there. Maybe you could also tell us what you think is different between this anti-humanism, or the anti-humanism you'd characterize it as, and post-humanism, and what these mean as categories for fascism.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. And you did note when mentioning the LA Review of Books piece that it was a brief piece, and one that certainly could use some elaboration, particularly around these concepts. And it's something that I'm working on and thinking about. Before I answer the question, I just have a quick anecdote to relate, which really sort of brought this home. That is to say, it brought home some of the uncomfortable overlaps between the far right rejection of the Enlightenment legacy and what you see, again, within certain quarters of sort of cultural studies or identity politics, or you could say decolonial left. I was at a seminar a couple of years ago where this young UCLA historian was talking about how he taught European history from a decolonial standpoint, and basically went through some of the key moments of European history as we know it, part of the meta-narrative of European history and the Enlightenment. So, things like the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, Reformation, the Enlightenment, French Revolution, constitutionalism, and so on. And what came out of this approach was a kind of skepticism about the, let's say, universalizability of certain aspects of this legacy, right? So it was a kind of skepticism. And in my question to him, I noted that, that skepticism is really shared on the far right, skepticism around science, a skepticism around constitutionalism, a skepticism around certainly the universalist legacy of the Enlightenment and of the French Revolution. Fascism was geared specifically to a rolling back, as you pointed out, of the Enlightenment legacy, including the French Revolution. And so I think it was very uncomfortable for him when I asked this question, because it did seem that there is this kind of overlap in terms of a rejection of this legacy. So this was one of the things that I wanted to get at, and we see this in the very definition of postmodernism, which relates very much to a rejection of the universalism that you could say lies at the heart of a certain kind of, let's say, critical humanism. And you see this in the very definition of postmodernism in The Postmodern Condition by Jean-François Lyotard at the beginning of the 1980s, which actually came out of a study commissioned by a province in my country, which was Quebec. And it was entitled a report on the state of knowledge. And Lyotard basically rejects, or he says that postmodernism is a skepticism or incredulity towards meta-narratives. And these meta-narratives are the twin meta-narratives of Hegel and Marx, both of whom rely on a certain notion of Wissenschaft, right? Scientific socialism for Marx, and the science of logic of Hegel. And I think that this rejection of meta-narratives in the interest of, or in favor of, the local narrative, or petit récit, the idea of kind of local language games a la Wittgenstein, is a little bit uncomfortable today when we see so much skepticism voiced towards not only liberal democratic institutions, but we could say procedures more generally, and procedures that could be, in a sense, said to be universalizable procedures. But when we talk about science, we talk about the scientific method. And this is what seems to be really under attack today. So I would say that the idea of posthumanism is tied to a certain kind of rejection of universalism that's also shared by the left, or certain elements of the left. I don't have to say that. It's always certain elements of the left rather than the left as a whole. So it also, though, entails the increasing sort of, in terms of societal logics, the increasing obsolescence of the human being via technology, machine learning, AI, and so on, and the constitution of increasing sways of populations, human subjects, as abandoned subjects, or what Mbembe calls the becoming black of the world and critique of black reason. We see this more recently in terms of the claim that the elderly ought to sacrifice their lives for their grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and go out and participate in the economy in the context of a pandemic. Also, I want to signal the fact that both, right and left, not only abandoned a certain universalist legacy, but then also, especially in terms of certain segments of the left, when they do that, they abandon a certain kind of justification of socialism, which I think really draws on that universalist legacy of the Enlightenment. So I think in the middle part of the 20th century, the 20s and 30s, I think that it was really this legacy that was being contested. So fast forward to today, I think you have a kind of more general skepticism that's shared by both right and left about this legacy. And I think that really needs to be challenged. And one book that is challenging this very well, very brilliantly, in fact, is a book written by my former teacher, Atu Seshiotu, who's a brilliant Fanon scholar, but he's written now a collection of essays entitled Left Universalism, Africa-centric essays, where he tries from an African perspective, he's based in Ghana now, to reclaim this radical tradition of the Enlightenment. And I think we need more of those kinds of, more of those kinds of arguments.
Right, so that's completely different to how I had read it. So that's really exciting. The closest part that you gave here was the idea of what I guess has been like really kind of contentiously called surplus population, which seems to relate directly to what is really quite like a well-established far-right theme of overpopulation, in the sense that the humans, particularly racialized groups of humans, have been rendered, or always perhaps were, in the case of the far right, structurally obsolete and kind of can now be kind of carved off from humanity, and only a limited number of humans will kind of be able to progress into the future. And therefore, with that, you get the return of a kind of passive or negative eugenics, whereby people are kind of simply abandoned. Do you think that this is where new far-right movements might emerge from, in the context of global climate systems breakdown, from in some ways, like the crisis of these disposable, or the crisis of the existence of disposable categories of people, in their view?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think we're so far apart in terms of our understanding of this idea of post-human fascism, insofar as I do think it very much relates to the idea of abandoned subjects and the becoming black of the world. And you do see this logic in play here in North America. I can give you an example in very close to where I live, actually, where they're trying to put a pipeline in that's to take bitumen from the Albertan tar sands into markets in the Far East via salt water. Although, of course, now the global downturn in the price of oil, I think, has really stalled the project. But they're still trying. And I think what's interesting is that heretofore, it had really only been indigenous lands that had been affected, and the state would use every means at its disposal to ensure that resources were extracted and transported to markets as expeditiously and cost effectively as possible. But now, as a pipeline nears the ocean, it is actually going through land owned by settlers, and they are, in a sense, being treated to the same kind of heavy-handedness of both the corporation and the state. So, I mean, I think that there's this, in a way, in a very kind of mild way, this could be understood as the becoming black of the world, insofar as the will of these citizen subjects really becomes absolutely inconsequential to the demands of the state and capital to achieve their conjoint objectives. So I think that this the analysis that we've been discussing, you and I, through correspondence of Marx's and capital, of surplus populations, as created as a result of the tendential logic of capital accumulation, is exactly right. And I think one of the things that has been pointed to is the way in which the creation of surplus populations has a profound decomposing effect on labor, creating these deep divisions and tensions between organized labor on the one hand, and then those workers in the informal sector, those workers who work full time but are highly super exploited, those workers who are precarious, whose conditions of labor are radically contingent, and those who are completely excluded from the labor market altogether. And I think one of the profound effects of such a decomposition is the rise of identity politics. You could see this in terms of the ethno-nationalism that is coursing through the United States, and also to some extent Canada, and through Europe, as well as on the other side of it, the rise of identity politics as a way for groups to seize some form of power under conditions of absolute abjection. And I think this is really key to understanding the way in which elements of the white working class are appealed to. The appeal is to a certain sense of security that would be established through the erection and fortification of borders. We also, can point to, and this relates to the earlier example that I gave, the way in which Mark Meadows admitted not too long ago, it was probably about a month and a half ago, that the White House had no plan to systematically tackle the coronavirus. You could see here perhaps a calculation that certain segments of the society, so not just the elderly, who are, of course, economically no longer playing a role that could be seen as socially useful, given capitalist conditions. But beyond that, the predominantly marginalized, racialized labor force that had been seen to be hit particularly hard, right? It almost seems as if it were a strategy to just devastate these communities as part of a larger ethno-nationalist strategy. So these categories of workers, these forms of surplus population, surplus labor, are themselves entirely expendable. So I think you can see this logic here. And, certainly in the UK, with the formerly colonized populations in major urban cities like London, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Bradford, and so on, you have a similar kind of sense that these are the communities that are hit particularly hard, both just in terms of their physical health, but also we've seen the study that just came out yesterday about how devastating the pandemic has been and will be for some time to come on mental health.
Yes, so I think that's those feelings of that kind of abandonment is absolutely essential to understanding how power might be operating at the moment and how power will continue to operate over the next few decades. I wanted to kind of go into this kind of not only mental health aspect, but maybe like to open up the other side of your work, which is in psychoanalysis, or the kind of the politics of psychoanalysis. And you've read in one of your essays in this new book, Spectres of Fascism, from Pluto Press 2020. Go and get it; it's really great. Which is about Adorno. You talk about the figure of the little big man, and the kind of two aspects of that. On the one hand, King Kong, this kind of fantasy of immense power. On the other hand, the provincial barber, right, who is a kind of a figure of like mundanity. And the splitting of these two, the splitting of the ego into these two figures allows the people, the fascist in Adorno's topology, to understand themselves simultaneously as the victim and the kind of the powerful person. And so it's this kind of split between, on the one hand, an assertion of power and a real feeling of helplessness that kind of characterizes or kind of the fascist kind of subjectivity or kind of psychology in some sense. And this is definitely true. I mean, you get, and I think we're getting that increasingly in contemporary extreme right groups, so kind of terroristic neo-Nazi organizations like the National Socialist Order in America or something like that. You get this kind of absolute assertion of sovereignty. But at the same time, you get really quite interesting movements like, for example, the rise in spirituality movements, which have increasingly a kind of slightly racist edge, right? There's increasingly kind of a cosmic right aspect to these things. And of course, you fit kind of QAnon at least partially into that. And so there's this kind of reassertion of sovereignty through either neo-Nazism or through a kind of autonomous spiritual practice. And I guess I wonder if you could tell us, like, you've spoken in conversation with Vladimir Safatile. I don't know how to pronounce that. About the proletariat and proletarian consciousness, which I think is described as the force of negation which has no predicate. I wonder where you could think about this in terms of, I guess, like a thoroughgoing anti-fascism, like about anti-fascism as a non-identity, or an identity that kind of refuses its own identification. Maybe that's successfully Adornian. Is there a connection here between, on the one hand, a rejection of predicateness, or like having a kind of predicate, or being subject to a kind of determination by power, and the anti-fascist life, to kind of borrow some terms from Foucault?
Yeah, right. Okay, that's there's a lot there. And
sorry, yes, that was too many questions.
It's great. I really appreciate the question. I think just to make a coherent answer will be perhaps a bit of a challenge, but I'll try. I'll start with Adorno's analysis and go back to the first exchange, and that was about liberal democracy and Samir Amin's definition of fascism. And I think here's where we really need to focus on the contradictory nature of liberal democracy, and how this then inherently creates tensions within subjectivity, contradiction within subjectivity, which you were alluding to. But I think we really need to be clear about this. So it's not, and this relates to the question of like an ethic of an anti-fascist living. We go very badly wrong when we say the problem with our present is that there are figures who possess power or sitting in office, like Trump and Bolsonaro and Modi and Orban and so on. All we need to do is get rid of these figures and we'll be fine. Obviously, you would agree with that. Then the more sophisticated analysis is, no, there are conjunctural conditions that give rise to movements and social forces that then put these kinds of figures in power, right? So we need to then address the structural conditions. And still we could have some notion of, the halcyon days of capitalism. And if we could only get back to like a New Deal liberalism, Green New Deal is something that I definitely support and so on. So don't get me wrong there. But I don't think we're getting deep down enough in our analysis. And I think this is what Adorno enables us to do, is that capitalism isn't just an objective set of social relations, the contradiction between the means of production and the forces of production, the capitalist state, and so on, that we can understand in objective terms. But we also have to understand the way in which capitalism generates a certain form of subjectivity, right? And so what he focuses on is on the way in which liberal democracy has a particular contradiction built into it, which we could say waxes and wanes, but certainly under neoliberal capitalism over the last 40 years has really waxed. And this is the following, that on the one hand, insofar as it's democratic, liberal democracy promises us not just voting rights, the ability to participate in a political process every so often, right? At the municipal level, the state level, regional level, and the national level. Rather, what it does is it promises us the possibility of living an autonomous life. That is to say that we have both individually and collectively as a community the ability to determine our own destinies. That's the great promise of democracy, right? On the other hand, because democracy is wedded to the logic of capitalism, the market, which is not a free market, but a market that is fundamentally regulated by the state to capitalist ends, we find then that our lives are increasingly dominated by not autonomy, but its opposite, heteronomy. There are all these forces that we can scarcely understand, let alone alter and change and control. So we are in this contradiction whereby we are promised autonomy, but what's actually delivered by liberal democracy is exactly the opposite. And under neoliberalism, as I've suggested, and I think this is just a fact, we have less and less control over our lives. So that creates this sense of anxiety, frustration, anger, which then is channeled in very combustible political directions by authoritarian populists and fascists who take advantage of this logic. So when we see somebody like Bolsonaro or Trump or Modi, we see that they are both, in a sense, as they say today, relatable. You know, they are like us. So they, in a sense, are you know, in a way, diminished subjects, right? We can relate to them in our own insufficiency and inadequacy and outsiderness, as it were. But at the same time, they embody the image of power and strength, which they turn against the other, which they seek to mobilize their forces against the stranger, right, the non-identical, and which we both participate in vicariously. We take a kind of, or the follower, I'm not saying myself or you, but the follower will then take a vicarious kind of interest and pleasure in that extirpation. But that's what we increasingly are encouraged to do as followers. We see this in the rallies. We see this in, you know, random attacks on marginalized, racialized people, LGBTQ plus people, especially trans people. What the authoritarian can never countenance is ambiguity, right? And what the queer person represents is ambiguity as almost a political gesture. And this cannot be tolerated by the authoritarian. So, yeah, I mean, what the great, the little great man represents, the composite of King Kong and a suburban barber represents is this constellation, almost as a kind of dialectical image of the autonomy, the sovereignty, and heteronomy of liberal democratic society. So I will both subordinate myself to my leader, and I'll be excessively cruel to those who are marginalized, who have less power than me. So I both feel powerful, but I'm also ultimately, at the end of the day, powerless.
I think this also gives a really clear explanation of why it is that the military has formed such a cohesive and also propulsive symbolic system for fire movements for the last 100 years, but also because of the experience of the military seems to me to be, I mean, I'm not in the military and I've been in the military, so this is very much talking a kind of second or third hand experience, but seems to be for both uns Junge and for people who, you know, come back from the Vietnam War and reform the KKK, and for people who return from the Iraq War and become members of white nationalist organizations in the alt-right and so on, right? What seems to be common across these experiences is an attempt to find in military prowess a form of self-control that the military seems to offer, you become the kind of consummate, self-declared and self-determining person. But of course, what modern war, since the mid-19th century, actually means, or maybe even before that, I'm not a military historian either, maybe even before that, actually entails is, as you say, absolute heteronomy. You have no control over what you do. You are subject to vast systems of logistical kind of coordination that you just don't understand at all. And so what you get in the various kinds of experience that people kind of report from, the Free Corps to, the KKK to, these contemporary war veterans, is this experience of attempting to radicalize the military experience that didn't go far enough, that didn't allow them enough personal control because it didn't allow them enough violence, or didn't allow them enough lassitude to take out violence. you get these very kind of strange and horrifying testimonials from people, and they say, of course I killed people in Iraq and I killed people in Afghanistan and so on, but I was always, told by my commanding officer I shouldn't, and that was the kind of the shame. The shame was not in the murderousness. I wanted to kind of think about this other question I was asking earlier about the negative identity or the non-identity or the identity of the non-identical or something like this, right? Whether or not we're doing Hegel or Adorno or Marx or how do you think this works in thinking about how you might live in a way that is opposed to fascism at this microscopic state or at this kind of psychoanalytic state? How does this give us a path forward?
Yeah, okay, that's right. I did skirt that question. I think it's the most interesting aspect of the series of questions you raised. And I come back to the point that I made earlier, and that is that you see a mirroring of an identity politics of the right in an identity politics of the left. And I think that identity formations such as this have to engage precisely in an extirpation of the non-identical, right? So, I'm a member of X or Y ethnic group, and that means that identification takes priority over other aspects of my identity. That could be related to sexuality, it could be related to class affiliation, could be related to any number of things. And people who advocate intersectionality, which wants to understand identity is produced at the intersections of complex structures of oppression, will challenge me on that and challenge this kind of argument. But I think when it comes down, when push comes to shove, there's always one identity that seems to take priority over others. And that leads then to this repression or extirpation of what doesn't fit, right? Of what must get brushed away in order for individuals to be subsumed beneath these more general categories. And I think there is an authoritarian logic. And I've written about this in terms of art, for example, when you have certain advocates of and self-appointed representatives of certain communities saying X object or X painting or X performance must go because we're offended as a group. Well, I mean, is that the case? What democratic procedures led to that outcome? I would be very interested to know. But it doesn't happen in this way. You have an authoritarian kind of pronunciamento about what the position is, what is to be countenanced and what is not. So I think right there, there is a problem with identity politics. It's inherently authoritarian. But going beyond that, in the intersectional analysis, there is this tendency to say that we need to look at gender, sexuality, ethnic identity, and class. So class, in a way, gets simply tagged on to these other kinds of identifications. And I think that this is exactly the wrong way to look at it, because these things are not equivalent, right? If I have a particular ethnic identity, or certainly a particular kind of gender identity, I want that to be recognized, right? I want that to be affirmed through the use of pronouns, for example. This is why pronouns are so important, because this is how people will identify others in the public sphere. And that's very much central to their reality and their sense of being, right? Recognition. Now with class, if we're just simply engaged in a kind of social democratic sort of analysis, say, okay, class is always going to be with us. There's always going to be class divisions. And it's a matter of simply of, redistributing wealth such that those within the working class, and let's say the surplus labor will be looked after and given certain minimal welfare payments or unemployment benefits or whatever, that's fine. But the idea from advocates of intersectionality is a much more radical one. Well, if you're really going to be radical about class, what you want is, in fact, the abolition of class, not its recognition. And that means a radical transformation of society. And that's why we want to say that class identity doesn't have predicates in this sense, that what proletarian identity signifies is precisely the demand for its own dissolution, right? Its own dissolution. When we start giving predicates to proletarian identities, we get into very, very difficult kinds of political logics, because they have a tendency to become very exclusionary very quickly for the kinds of empirical, historical, and sociological reasons that we talked about earlier, in terms of these conflicts and tensions that arise through the decomposition of the working class. Right, and you end up, as Trump was musing just prior to the election in the spring, prior to the election of 2016. I want to transform the Republican Party into a workers' party. Well, you can imagine exactly where that logic ends up, and it becomes very much like National Socialism. So this is precisely why we insist that the proletarian identity is thoroughgoing negative identity, one that actually seeks its own negation. So this is the negation of the negation, right? The negation of class as such. And that should be the utopic horizon upon which we're functioning. And why not also then extend that to other identities? That becomes a more difficult argument for the reasons I gave earlier, but I think that's probably where utopia lies. And it is, in some sense, I think, what Herbert Marcuse meant in terms of polymorphous perversity. This should be what we're aiming for.
I have a question about how that relates to comradeship, but I realize that we're a podcast about the far right, and we should stick to that topic. I think it's a really important. I do
have a kind of panel discussion with Jody Dean at the end of January, so that'll probably come up. But yes, her deconstruction of allyship is fantastic for precisely this reason. So you reinscribe a notion of national sovereignty when you assert the importance of allyship. Well, I think it's very similar with the kind of proprietary relationship that people have vis-a-vis their own identities, right? My identity is my property, and so hands off, right? Well, that's interesting. That is a thoroughgoing neoliberal logic at the level of, in a sense, ontology, right? At the level of who one is, or who one thinks one is,
I've been thinking for about 2 years, I guess now, more or less exclusively about far right politics. Do you think that it's necessary to have, even when you're doing kind of anti-fascism, which seems to be, to me, a politics almost that only knows utopia negatively, and not only that it only knows utopia negatively in the Adornian sense, and that it all it can hope for is the end not of fascism, but of the possibility of fascism. That is the classless society we call communism, right? It seems that the anti-fascism's utopia becomes out in this kind of strict negative manner, but that strict negative manner is also often quite small and quite kind of puritanical in various ways. And I wonder, how do we now kind of final question about like the relation between fascism and far right studies as an academic pursuit and anti-fascist movements. I wonder what you think the connection is there. I think this project this podcast is an attempt really to kind of bridge that gap, to think about how the two things can kind of fit together, because it seems to be that they're talking at cross purposes very often. Anti-fascist movements develop structures, identities, elaborate rules, and at the same time, I totally agree with the kind of this aspect of the theory that tries to negate the form of identity. So how do you see these two things sitting together? The academic pursuit on one hand and the movement structure on the other?
Well, that's a really good question. I would introduce a third term here, and I would maybe place you in that third term. So there's sort of academic discourse, and then there's movement politics, but then there's also an intellectual intervention as well. And the intellectual and the academic are always the same. And those two are often in quite a bit of tension. Academia is very much oriented towards disciplines and, institutions and organizations within the academic sphere that organize conferences and journals, and one has to get tenure and then get promoted, and one has to publish in the right places and network with the right people. So I think that that is a rather more complex set of forces and constellation of institutions. Whereas I think the most interesting work that gets done is in that intellectual sphere, because intellectuals are also, right from their very, inception with the Dreyfus crisis, they're engaged. They're engaged with the public sphere, I think, in different ways, both on the left and on the right. And I think with the activists, there is, unfortunately, and there has been now for some time, a kind of anti-intellectualism there. It's anti-academia, and I think there's some justification for that, for the reasons I just mentioned. But it can often be anti-intellectual. And I think with Antifa and with many anarchist formations, there is this move to shut down discussion. And I think this is, in a way, mirroring the very thing that you're trying to confront. And this is it's a criticism that Adorno had of the West German students movement, right? He was very supportive of them, but he also detected a kind of authoritarianism that drove them in their attempt to confront, in a sense, the real afterlife of fascism. They were right in identifying that afterlife, and we're seeing it today in the German police force and the military, in civil society. But of course, this is from the former DDR more than the former Federal Republic. But nonetheless, there. And I think this is why Adorno links up so well with Foucault's preface to Anti-Oedipus, because it is about trying to come to terms with the fascism that we harbor within ourselves and our responses to fascism, right? They can, in a sense, be a form of, to use an Adornian term, mimesis. We mimic that which we want to somehow try and overcome. And this is a real danger. And I think we see this so much. And it gets back, let's in a sense bring it full circle back to the question of liberal democracy, that the increasing attempt to engage in censorship, to shut down book publishers, to shut down art exhibitions, to cancel people for things that they may say that are found to be objectionable, is highly problematic, because these are, in a way, Gestapo tactics. The Antarctica Kunst exhibition is something, we could see something like that today that's put on by the left. I mean, no joke. And I think we have to really question how it is that we got to this point, and how is it that it's the right that is making these specious and cynical arguments for free speech, and the left really doesn't want to touch the issue anymore. Right? Why is that? I think that spells part of the kind of deeply convoluted times in which we live.
So you got a new book out, Pluto Press. Tell us about Spectres of Fascism. I hear it's the first volume of a two-part thing that's going on. So tell us about the first part, and then tell us about what might happen for the collection of essays in the second part.
Where did you hear that about it being the first part of a larger project?
On another podcast that you did with the university, with Simon Fraser University, I think.
Okay.
Is it not true?
I might have misrepresented myself. I mean, I would like to actually take up more specifically Adorno's contribution to understanding fascism. And I think the way I would want to do that is to sort of pose the question of whether or not we can understand Adorno's entire work as a kind of anti-fascist philosophy, insofar as one of his first engagements is with the work of Martin Heidegger. And that continues all the way through to negative dialectics. And if there's any philosophy that could, I think, claim to be a fascist philosophy, it's Heidegger's. And there's various nuances to that. So I think setting up this confrontation would be very worthwhile. So maybe that's the second part of it. But here's the book here. And just very briefly, it's organized in 3 parts. And these 3 parts were part of what we called a free school at the Institute for the Humanities, which I'm director of at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. And, we were so alarmed at some of the developments that were happening around the world, not least the election of Donald J. Trump in the United States, that we felt that we should respond to this. And this is part of the mandate of the Institute, is to respond by drawing on the tradition of the humanities to the sort of central questions of our age. So we had a series of lectures divided into a kind of theoretical segment or a historical segment, theoretical segment, and then looking at sort of contemporary realities. So the book really came out of that, and it was very much a public-oriented exercise. And one of the things that we made very clear was that in these evenings that we had, virtually all of the lectures were in the evening, that the first half of the lecture would be precisely that, a talk and then a question period, be very much focused on intellectual matters. Then the second half would be social. We had a DJ who curated music that was specific to the theme or topic of the night, and there would be some dancing, refreshments would be had, some snacks. And that was in the spirit of a recognition of the fact that one of the aspects of the appeal of fascism, and this is, this comes directly out of Hannah Arendt's work, is a sense of isolation, right? People feel isolated. They feel deracinated, and they then feel some sense of belonging in the mass. So we thought we ought to try and concretely counteract this in a space that's both within the university but also outside of it. We had most of our events at this small art gallery in Gastown in Vancouver called Unit Pit Projects. It was a wonderful space in which we could have these talks, and also this place that is now defunct called Selector Records. It's one of the many casualties, not of the pandemic, but of the larger problem, and you know this in Britain and in London in particular, of gentrification. So that was the context out of which this book has come, and so far the reception has been very engaged and positive.
Yes, all books should emerge from kind of parties, I think. What music did they play? Was it can't be Kurt Weill, right? Surely not.
There was definitely some Kurt Weill. When we had a talk on the Spanish Civil War, there was, of course, Spanish Bombs by The Clash, and sort of reggae, anti-fascist music, and all kinds of things. We had a terrific sort of professional DJ who volunteered his time to do this. So it was great.
There'll be a playlist in the show notes. Thank you very much. Go and check that book out. It's a really fantastic collection of essays. We've only touched on very, very few of the kind of the many, many, many parts of that book. I
guess there was no point for me to hold it up.
If you could hold it up if you want, but no one will be able to see. But thank you very much for being here. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again very soon.
Thanks very much, Sam.
And I'd like to leave you with what is indisputably the greatest piece of anti-fascist music ever made. The link is in the show notes.
In the eyes of the government, we are the enemy.
In a world where there is no government, anarchy rules. This summer, get ready for most action-packed podcast.
We continue fighting because we hate all authority and love freedom, which cannot be given, but must be taken.
Such scenes as, "This is not a dialogue," "A crime called freedom," "Party's over," and many, many more.
For more text and audio material of interest to anarchists,
check out resonanceaudiodistro.org.
Thanks a lot for listening. If you enjoyed that, then you can help support the podcast on Patreon. All the support we get means a lot to us, and it really does help us grow this project. So that's patreon.com/12 rules for what, and you can sign up for as little as $2 a month. Thanks a lot, and I will see you very soon.
12 rules.